record and then send it.
Okay.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. So I would start with, if you don't mind, some personal questions, like personal, professional questions, of course, and then we'll go to more like opinionated questions and like general view and everything. So thank you for agreeing to do this with me. I'm very happy to be having this meeting / interview with you. It's going to be definitely a mark in my career or like future. So I'm very happy and proud. I'd like to start with like a simple question. So I've read a lot about you, like through your CV, through Google, through the introduction that you sent me. But if it's up to you, like how would you introduce yourself? What would you say about yourself, or how would you like to be remembered, or like all of these questions?
Wow. That's a very good question. I think it's, it's a subjective question. But one of the Black leaders from the U.S. here who actually spent some time in jail after a lot of repression from the movement of the 60s and 70s, and there was a particular program in the U.S. called COINTELPRO, the Counterintelligence Program, which was very clearly, even by the U.S.'s own laws, an illegal program of repression, mainly from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, although local police forces were involved as well, and mainly targeting the Black movement, Black Panthers and other, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and others. But the Black Panthers got a big piece of it. And I say this because one of the early people who influenced me, a Panther who spent close to 20 years in prison. When he came out, he said, back in the days, at the height of the movement, we used to talk about how we need to be objective, objective, objective. We must really look at things carefully and objectively. But what was lost in some of that was the importance and the power of the subjective, because the subjective and the ways we felt and the relationships we built with one another uh, were in many ways just as important and as significant as being objective about the conditions we were facing and the strategies to make them better. So I take that to say that your question is a very subjective and in some ways wonderfully subjective question, because the legacy question and also how I introduce myself depends so much on the audience. And I think in many cases, I have also been moved by those folk who said, there's a famous progressive anti-war folk singer named Charlie King who had a famous song called "Our Life is More Than Our Work, and Our Work is More Than Our Job." And so I do feel like, it's very common. You introduce yourselves and you say, I'm a teacher, I'm a professor, I'm a, teacher trainer, I'm a, PhD student, I'm a PhD, I'm a, postdoctorate fellow, I'm a, all of the titles we give and the initials we give at the end of our names, that they become in some ways a stand-in for the way we introduce ourselves. And of course, now in this generation, we're also using something that was unheard of just 20 years ago. We say pronouns next to our names, which used to be a matter of basic assumption. But we're not defined by our pronouns and we're not defined by our jobs. So how we self-introduce becomes a more and more complex and multifaceted issue. I used to have when I especially when I was doing training of high school teachers at Columbia University Teachers College, when I was a professor there for a time. I always had these teachers, these incoming teachers, do go-arounds introducing themselves. And I used to note, well, how many of you really introduce yourselves by saying, some of them would introduce themselves by saying their race. I'm a proud Black mother. Very few white people or non-Black, brown, indigenous, non-people of African and Latinx descent, very few so-called white people would introduce themselves referencing race or ethnicity. And I would always point that out. And even fewer people of any race, creed, or ethnicity would introduce themselves noting their gender. And so I'd say in processing, well, that's very interesting. You all introduced yourselves first saying what your job was, and then some of you saying what your ethnicity was, but none of you said your gender. Are you suggesting gender is not important to your identity? And of course, then they'd all say, no, of course it is. I just didn't. So yeah, this introduction thing is I think, an interesting and complex question, and a little bit different than the legacy question. So I guess I would say that, yes, I am proud. I'm aware of and try to be aware of my space and place in the world. My gender, not just my pronouns, my race and ethnicity and past background, which does not define me in totality at all, but does reference some of who I am as a lived experience. Because I am, from a theological and religious and spiritual perspective, multidisciplinary. I don't belong to one single church. I usually don't do that, just because it's complex. It's a little too complex, and is a whole other discussion, a whole other can of worms that would open up if I were to begin that. So I usually don't. I was for a time the national chair of an interfaith group called the Fellowship of Reconciliation. I still serve as the chair of the International FOR's Financial Advisory Committee. So in those spaces, when I introduce myself, I'll speak a little bit more about my theological and religious and spiritual self-definitions. But I generally don't do that because it gets too complicated. I do often reference my job, but I very rarely, and I think I've noted that to you, I don't prefer to be called doctor or professor. And I also have a very bad habit of not calling anyone else by those titles. So if people really expect and want a certain amount of that kind of recognition, um, I try to be very respectful in all the ways I relate to people, but I don't give people titles. I call including my own medical doctor. I don't call my own medical doctor doctor. I have consistently called my medical doctors by their first names, just because that's my thing. It's a way of sort of equalizing our experiences as humans. We all have skills, we all have talents, we all have jobs, and meet me as a person before you take my blood pressure. So okay, that's some of the answer. But yes, but I do reference, I guess most often and most quickly, when I'm not being interviewed, but I'm just answering that question quickly, I will answer the who I am question by my most recent organizational representational affiliation. So it's most common now for me to say, hi, I'm Matt Meyer, I'm the Secretary General of the International Peace Research Association. Just because in most of the worlds I float in, as an academic, as an organizer, as an activist, as a public speaker, what they want to know is, where are you coming from politically, organizationally, operationally, academically? So yes, International Peace Research Association, and my title within it, answers a bunch of those questions quickly for people. Sometimes I'll say, yes, I'm a professor, retired at University of Massachusetts Amherst, but I only say that if they must hear a college or a university to hear that I'm legitimate, I'll add that on. Or like for example, I mean, I have a UMass Amherst email address and edu email address, but I don't use that. But some people really need to see that edu address, or they won't think I'm actually an academic. So okay. And I guess lastly, I do like to consistently, including in my, the blurbs that are on the books, because I'm an author. So it says author, author, academic, author, educator, something like that. But I do like to, in those blurbs, when I have more than 3 words or 5 words to say an organization's name, I do like to talk about being a father, because to me, I've learned as much from my children as I teach them, and they've influenced my life, I would say, as much as I influence theirs. And that dialectic between the generations and between peoples and within family uh, is such a significant part, I think, of life in general, including work life, including jobs, including who we are in the world. That referencing that I'm a parent of, 2 amazing kids, one of Trinidadian descent, actually, and one of Mexican descent. So it's also part of the inter multicultural world that I live in, at home as well as out in the world. But yes, that parent thing is probably the last piece of my self introduction. I'll say one more sentence. Legacy is a slightly different thing, and it's hard at a certain age. I found it hard not to think about legacy. Not that I'm planning to go anywhere for a while. I'm hoping to be here for quite a bit longer. But the fact is, although, little medical hiccups at a certain age, it's like, wow, is that a little one or a big one? Okay, looks like a little one. But the fact is, I feel like most of my legacy is contained in my books. I mean, my kids, obviously, but ultimately, to be successful, they have to be their own person. But for my personal, unique legacy, that's in my books. So if you want to ask me about my legacy, I'll tell you about this particular line of thinking that I try to put out in these particular books, or that particular line in that particular books. And that, to me, as much as possible, embodies the legacy question, as far as I'm concerned.
Thank you so much. Well, I can see the passion every time you speak about what you do, so which is wonderful. So that will lead me to my next question about passion. Some people are born knowing their passion, or at least not born, maybe from a young age, they know that they'll be a musician, they know that they'll be doctors, this and that. Um, some others, like me, they found their passion late in life, which is okay, because for every 21, 23 years old, it's sometimes difficult to know what you want from life or what you're going to do in life. So when was the moment or the moments you decided, this is what I want to do, this is how I'm going to spend my future?
That's a very good question. I guess I want to speak strongly for not knowing, and also for being opened. Because, for example, for me, in maybe late middle school, somewhere in my, what they call tweens, 12, 13, 14, and then my teens, uh, probably up through the end of my teens, maybe even through the time I was about 20 years old, I was pretty sure I wanted to be a lawyer. I was pretty sure that that was what I was going to do, and that's what I wanted to do. And it seemed like a happy choice. It's not that I have family members that are lawyers. It just seemed like that was sort of the way I thought, methodically and problem solved, and it seemed like it fit. And my father was a high school teacher, secondary school teenagers, all his life, of English. He was a literature and English language person. And I was equally sure in those years that I never ever wanted to do that. I was not going to do that. And the beginning of my work life, really, at age 21, was becoming a high school teacher. I was teaching history, not English. And that lasted for a good number of years before I went into the academy and became a professor. So I think that alone suggests that you can go pretty far into one's 20s and be very sure of one thing, and then something else entirely is what comes about. And I think that's not only fine but probably correct. And the idea of thinking mid-career, I still think in part that perhaps I'm going to be a rock and roll star, but okay, suggesting maybe that might, I don't know. Yeah, okay, it's nice to cross your fingers, but I think early on, and I wouldn't have necessarily been able to say this with certainty until fairly recently, but I think it's correct to say that I always had a writing bug. I always liked writing. So the idea that I would produce books, that I would be a writer, what kind of books, on what topics, that much later. But the fact that I would be involved in some ways in authorship was something that hit me early and have stayed with me to this day. I think another thing that hit early in terms of passion, which I did get in part from my parents and my grandparents, even though they were not activists or organizers in any way, was this idea that peace and justice was important and integrated. This idea that even though I didn't live in a community or in my immediate surroundings that had tremendous violence, that there was a sense that it was just beyond the door, whether it was growing up at the time when the U.S. was at the height of its involvement in war in Southeast Asia and Vietnam, and the tragedy of that war seemed clear just by turning on the TV, even as a young, as a boy, as a young man. And again, my parents had similar kind of knee-jerk feelings about that, even though they weren't organizers. So pretty much as soon as I became a young adult in my, late teens, early 20s, I jumped into, that work. I jumped into looking at organizations, academic and grassroots activists and community-based, that were doing peace and justice work. So that was pretty early on and has stayed consistent, throughout. The fact that at a certain point in my later 20s and then especially in my 30s, I could connect my pursuits as a teacher and then as a professor and an academic, a researcher, with my interest in peace and justice was, in some ways, it was natural. It was also a friendly connection. All of a sudden, a few people said, there's this organization we have, there's this field called peace studies, and because I didn't, none of my, I have not, essentially, I think maybe I took one course that might have been related to peace studies, but it wasn't a field that I was, an undergraduate or graduate student in. I went in there as an African history person, and as a teacher and as a writer, and then became part of the peace studies, peace research community. And I guess the last thing I'll say is somewhere in it's got to have been my mid to late 20s, maybe even earlier than that, I got this sense that focusing on Africa was something I wanted to do. Yeah, actually, come to think of it, it was just that began to be a theme that began to percolate in my head at age 20. And by the time I was 30, I had a good sense that I had already traveled by that time to Mozambique and Zimbabwe. Both of those countries in Southern Africa had gotten their independence less than 10 years earlier. So there was still a lot of excitement and heady visioning and sensibilities, as there were a lot of problems. And by the time I was 30, it was like, okay, this is what I want to devote my life to. And at that point, also, I'll say the path was unclear. Exactly how I would devote I mean, I got my undergraduate degree, I was getting my graduate degree, but exactly how I devote my life to that was somewhat unclear. But I have to say, and this is part of, I guess, the mix of things and answering the question, I created a vision. I mean, I literally created a certain vision, and from my passion and from my finding contacts and finding the right people and pushing them for answers. You know, like there was really no reason why at age 28 or 29, I should say, I'm going to meet Nelson Mandela or become friends with Archbishop Desmond Tutu or, you know, have lunch at the home of Mwalimu Julius Nyerere, the first president of independent Tanzania. You know, there's no reason why I should have imagined that at 29 or 30. And then by the time I was 40, have all those things come true. But they did, in part because I connected this passion and this vision with some people and continued the conversations and my interviewing. You know, I found a few Pan-African elders who seemed politically simpatico and personally cool, and I would interview them and talk to them and interview them again and raise some possibilities, and then possibilities became probabilities, which became plans, which became my life. So yeah, I have a great deal of advice about dreaming and then working consistently to try to make your dreams reality. Now, there's, I guess, another piece of it is there's no get rich quick. You can't dream, oh, I want to be a billionaire, I want to be a millionaire, and then, you know, go to the lottery and up, look, I won I have it. You know, that doesn't, you know, obviously one can be a gambling person. I'm not a gambling person. You work to make your visions become true. You modify your visions given the realities that are around you. But if you don't vision, well, then there's nothing.
Amazing. Thank you so much. So it's also wonderful that you achieved some things that you've never even imagined. Like you mentioned some things that in your 20s or 30s you haven't even thought would be possible. So dream big. I think that's definitely great advice. Dream big and work hard. Definitely.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean,
So
I brought back to me, like, you
mhm.
know, well, yeah, I mean, just the idea that we can do things. I mean, this tribunal that you've been working on with me, and that, you know, is coming up in a few days. It's in some ways a bigger framework than most of us working on it have ever been involved with. It's by certain, absolutely certain, a bigger framework for this particular type of work than has taken place in at least 30 or 40 years. At least that, if not ever, right? And yet, there's no piece of it that's a great mystery. There's no piece of it that's impossible. It's all having the vision and then putting together the right people to do a lot of hard work. And now we're going to have it, and it's going to happen. And I think it looks to be a success. Again, you dream, you work hard, and then you modify the dream. What kind of success it is, we don't know exactly yet. And maybe some surprise wonderfulnesses and some surprise problems. But that's just life. You adjust to those realities, those material, historic, on the ground realities. But you don't stop dreaming. You just modify, work hard, and dream again. So I think, yeah, those things from the 20s, those particular like high points, like, you know, meeting, you know, Madiba Nelson Mandela, or, you know, having Archbishop Tutu write the foreword to 3 of my books. Yeah, that's sort of like, wow. But it continues to be a part of my practice, you know, to think, oh, well, we can do that. And actually, it's better done if we think a little bit more exciting. If all we're thinking about is we're going to do the same thing we did yesterday, it's less exciting. But if you dream big, and especially if you plan ahead and you work hard, you're willing to work hard and surround yourself with other people who work hard, then amazing things can and will happen consistently.
For sure. Thank you so much for inspiring others. So you mentioned earlier that your legacy would be your books and the work that you have done as an author. So if you would recommend one book out of everything that you've done, what would you say? I know it's very difficult. You've probably put in so much work and everything, but if you get to choose one that the whole world can read, or which book?
That's such an unfair question. So let me say two things. Let me say three things. First, I see we should be done in. I have to be done in 5 minutes, and we're not done. We're not done. So this is going to be part one, and I will send you both the tape, and we'll pick another time after the tribunal next week, because the end of October and November, December, even if it's after this phase of your fellowship, if you want to do this, I'm available to you. This is your time, and it's my time too, but I'm very happy to do this, but not until next week. And we don't have to do that now, but we can even tomorrow during our regular meeting, we can look at our calendars and pick a time. So then the other two things I want to say about this highly unfair question. I don't think you can really ask a person what one book of theirs they would recommend. The same way I don't think you can really ask a person, look, I only have time to have one friend. Which of your children should become my friend? Which would you recommend? Like, would be more interesting to have dinner with. It's like, no, I can't choose between my children. If you're in this mood, talk to this one of my kids. And it's this. So yeah, I can't. I'm going to essentially. I'm going to answer the question, but I'm going to object to it from the beginning and strongly. So I think most authors. I think I would follow a traditional path of most authors by saying, well, of course, the book you should read most is the one that is my most recent, because that's the one that has, uh, the stuff I'm thinking about now, the cutting edge. What do we do today and tomorrow and 10 years from now? So in that sense, the book that's at the printer that's about to come out, I just did, this conference in Spain, which I was to be at this last weekend, and canceled. I still was there virtually, so we had the book launch in Barcelona last Saturday night, and the book should be out any moment now. But this book, Insurrectionary Uprisings, a reader in revolutionary nonviolence and decolonization. That's the full title of it. I'm very excited about it. It's a compendium of other writers' works as well as mine, but even just my pieces alone, from the introduction, the conclusion, and the several of my pieces that are in the body of the book, say some of the important things I've wanted to say for a long time about strategies and tactics and peace and justice in this moment. So I would have to say that my most recent book, about to come out in 2021. And then I guess I'll end today's session by saying one always has a soft spot for one's firstborn. So my first book, Guns and Gandhi in Africa, Pan-African Insights on Nonviolence, Struggle, and Liberation. I wish I was as good a writer as I am now, as I was 25 years ago when I wrote or co-wrote that book, because I read it and it has stories about having lunch with Julius Nyerere and having dinner at the home of Kenneth Kaunda of Zambia and meeting Graça Machel and et cetera, et cetera. And it tells lots and lots of other stories, but it also, it's anecdotal, but it also speaks to a certain series of points about nonviolence and armed struggle and liberation and their uses, problematic and possible, in the world we lived in the last half of the 20th century and continuing on for today. So I do have a very soft spot for that book. It built a lot of my thinking and work that's followed, but I wish I could rewrite it and make it a little bit more poetic, a little bit punchier, a little bit more jazzy. But we can always reinvent and re-improve ourselves. I let it stand for itself and all of its warts as well. So those are the two books under duress that I will give you as my answer to that question.
Oh, thank you so much. It's my first ever interview, so excuse me if it's gonna have like some weird questions. So yeah, since you have to go, of course, we have done with the first part, which includes like personal questions. So all my other questions will be involved around like world issues and points of view. So of course we can end it here today, and then next time we can go on other issues.
Excellent,
So thank you.
excellent. All right, dear. I will, because my day is particularly crazy. I'm going to end it quickly,
Mm-hmm.
but I look forward to seeing
Yeah.
you both tomorrow.
Yeah.
And yeah, hopefully you and Robert Allen can connect by email later today.
Okay.
And
Okay. Yes. Please send me this recording, and
yes, I will do
I
that
will.
later today for
Okay.
sure. All right.
Thank you.
Bye, y'all.
Bye.